films can be anything, that they can do anything. And therefore, it's incumbent on us as filmmakers to try and push whatever boundaries we can and not be, beholden to a theoretical rule set. I think that's the most strong form of characterization. People can talk about who they are and what motivates them, but you don't trust them. You wait and see, what do they actually do? What do they do to each other? I think in various ways, all the films I've done have relied on that film noir dynamic. There's always this question of, let's judge the characters based on what they do rather than what they say. It was about taking this beloved character and recontextualizing the character, setting this extraordinary figure in an ordinary world, or a seemingly ordinary world. What if we try to ground this and really explain how this might happen in a real world scenario? And so I wanted to address the story very much in the language of suspense. That's the most visual language of film there is.
One of the things we were trying to do in the film, by putting people as firmly as possible into Leonard's head, we were really trying to make the audience question their own process of memory a little bit.
That was really the challenge in making Inception, was to keep everything grounded, to keep everything feeling like it was possible, even as what's happening in the film is, on some level, impossible. I try and only think of the characters as real people. If you start thinking about actors while you're writing, you're going to limit what the character can be. I've always been fascinated by the nature of dreaming, the idea that while we're dreaming we can create a world, but perceive it at the same time without realizing that we're performing both those functions. To the extent where if we dream we're having a conversation with somebody, we're dreaming that person, we're also creating the words that are in that person's mouth, but we feel we're hearing them as if for the first time. It took me a long time to write the script because I based it on this idea of a heist movie set in the world of dreams. And the problem with a heist movie is they tend to be procedural, they tend to be deliberately superficial. And so it took me a long time to realize that when you're dealing with the world of dreams, that's not enough. You need emotion. And so the central character, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, became the most important part of making the story relatable for the audience. I thought long and hard about how you address this enormous story that's far too big to encompass in a movie. There's 400,000 people involved. A vast scale of myriad human experiences. And ultimately what I chose to do is focus on the elements that make the Dunkirk story unique from just another war film or whatever. And it's the survival aspect and the suspense aspect. And so I wanted to address the story very much in the language of suspense. That's the most visual language of film there is. And so it leads you towards an approach stripped down of dialogue, really looking to the visual masters of the past. This kind of storytelling is what I wanted to do. And so you wind up needing to fragment the story into, broadly speaking, land, sea, and air. These three strands that you intertwine over the course of the film. And the reason for that is I want to tell an intensely subjective version of this story. So I want to put the audience on the beach with the guys who are there on the beach. I also want to put them in the cockpit of a Spitfire with a pilot who's got about an hour's flying time over Dunkirk and is dogfighting with the enemy. So when you're cross-cutting these different timelines, you're never departing from the subjective storytelling, the human scale storytelling, but you are starting, hopefully, to build up a coherent picture of the larger events that need telling in any version of the Dunkirk story. So everything for me in this film is about intensity and suspense. It's about trying to stay in a human scale of storytelling, but get across with clarity the larger movements of the evacuation.
I'm very interested in the process of memory and the way it can be distorted and all the rest. And I know that Guy, the same as me, in going through making the film, we went through an intense process of questioning our own memories and the way it works. And I sort of came out the other side very much less confident of the way my memory worked than before. And then the script and Leonard's systems and the way the plot points come together relating to memory, they are just extrapolations of the way I try and help my short-term memory myself. You know, I write phone numbers in my hand, and I take notes, and, you know, I have souvenirs of things, and I use photography and all these different aids to kind of, you know, help me live life. And once you start identifying them, you start to realize that your process of memory is not as good as you hoped, and it's much more interpretive than you realized. And one of the things we were trying to do in the film, by putting people as firmly as possible into Leonard's head, we were really trying to make the audience question their own process of memory a little bit, the way we did while we were making the film.
I tend not to think of casting at all when I'm writing. So while I was rewriting Jonah's script, I try and only think of the characters as real people. If you start thinking about actors while you're writing, you're going to limit what the character can be.
Do you think of people you know?
No, they're just characters, and that's one of the great things about writing a screenplay is you get to create in that way. And then when you're finished and you've taken it as far as you can in the screenplay form, that's when you need these guys to come on and really make this.
Do you have a writing process? Do you lock yourself in? Do you write at night? Do you tear out your hair?
All of the above. Yeah. I think what I've carried with me about that experience, as far as my own films go, is really just a sense that films can be anything, that they can do anything. You know, what Kubrick did in 1968 is he simply refused to acknowledge that there were any rules that he had to play by in terms of narrative. And if there was any such rule book, he threw it out the window and went his own way. And I think any filmmaker being inspired by that, as so many filmmakers have been, they carry with them this idea that movies can do anything. And therefore, it's incumbent on us as filmmakers to try and push whatever boundaries we can and not be beholden to a theoretical rule set.
When you talk about dreams, you immediately start to think that that world is infinite, that anything is possible. What was interesting about Chris's take on this dream world, and what he was very specific with us about, is that it had its own set of rules, that you immediately start to talk about the human subconscious and entering the dream world, and you think, we could be flying around in other galaxies with mystical creatures and, insane settings, but he wanted it to be very deeply rooted in things we understood.
That was really the challenge in making Inception, was to keep everything grounded, to keep everything feeling like it was possible, even as what's happening in the film is, on some level, impossible.
Well, I've always been interested in that particular story element, or narrative element, that of the unreliable narrator, particularly when you are given very strongly that narrator's point of view through the film. But to me, it had always been a problem to come up with the appropriate reason for the narrator being unreliable. Because to me, it's never been interesting enough, if the guy is just lying, or if he's dreaming, or, whatever. But in this idea of My Brothers, I found a sort of perfect jumping off point to explore that method of storytelling, that idea of seeing the world through this very distorted point of view of one particular person.
I think I started off in the noir genre, as we talked about earlier, and that's a genre in which you define character through action. People can talk about who they are and what motivates them, but you don't trust them. You wait and see, what do they actually do? What do they do to each other? And that's essential to the way that genre works. I think that's the most strong form of characterization. And I think in various ways, all the films I've done have relied on that film noir dynamic, whether it's science fiction, like Interstellar or Inception, or action films like the Dark Knight trilogy. There's always an underlying film noir dynamic. There's always this question of let's judge the characters based on what they do rather than what they say. And I've always enjoyed that form of characterization. The original inspiration behind the Dark Knight trilogy, and particularly Batman Begins, it was about taking this beloved character and recontextualizing the character, setting this extraordinary figure in an ordinary world, or a seemingly ordinary world. And so for me, it was much more about creating a recognizably real scenario that the extraordinary figure of Batman could exist in, and addressing the origins of that, the origin story, which hadn't been told in films before, hadn't really even been addressed in the comics very specifically, actually. And so we were able to really look at that gap in pop culture and say, okay, what if we try to ground this and really explain how this might happen in a real world scenario? That was always the jumping off point for the tone of the film.
You said that Tenet brought things that you had been thinking about for at least 20 years. What was the moment you realized that the script was ready to shoot?
Well, it was more a question of the moment I realized that the set of ideas was ready to commit to the page in screenplay form. I won't sit down to write something until I kind of know that I'm ready to, and that the ideas are all in balance, and that can take a very long time. I'm not somebody who does a lot of multiple drafts over the years. I tend to just take notes and draw diagrams and think about concepts and sort of think about, okay, how could you apply that to different forms of storytelling? What might the screenplay be? But once I've kind of focused in on that set of ideas and I know I'm ready to put it into screenplay form, that's sort of the big leap for me. And then the screenplay is a sort of jumping off point for the execution of, you know, how you're actually going to go and make it.
And so we would stage the scenes in a very spontaneous way where the actors knew the dialogue, they knew the scene incredibly well. We would go to the location and they would walk it through, and then I would just follow them with the camera. And I think that was the right approach for me and set me on the path of always thinking about and considering the point of view of the storytelling. Where is the camera? Why is the camera where it is? And so just naturally, I started off on this journey that I've continued of always trying to think in 3 dimensions, not look at the shot as a 2-dimensional picture, but look at where everything is in 3-dimensional space. That's why I don't use a monitor on set to this day. I just stay by the camera because I want to see where things are in 3-dimensional space and then place the camera according to my idea of what the point of view is. And I like to try and align the audience quite closely with the point of view of a character in the film. That feels the most natural form of storytelling to me. I think really the only useful advice I ever got in terms of, you know, trying to figure out your way in to the film business, the film industry, is to get yourself a script and hang on to it. It's that idea, that screenplay, that concept, you know, whatever that's going to be, that's so important. And you have to stick to your guns. You have to find something that you can do that maybe other people couldn't do. And even if that seems different or doesn't fit into people's expectations, that's what's going to distinguish it if you can do it successfully. So I think it's really about sticking to your guns and, you know, doing something that you passionately believe in rather than trying to appeal to some desire that you imagine other people have for what they want to see in a film. I think you have to be true to your own passion and your own sense of what excites you as a storyteller. You have to play to your strengths. You have to do something that really excites you, and whatever's different about that. And in the case of following the non-linear structure was a somewhat unusual choice. But it's those things that are the strength of the project. It's the things that you can bring to what you're doing or bring to the filmmaking craft that maybe not everybody else is doing, maybe not everybody else can do or has thought to do. That's what's going to distinguish the thing. So it might seem in some ways more difficult or seem like something that would make the project more difficult to sell when it's finished, you know, what have you. But for me, I think the answer was definitely to try to play to my strengths and the things that I personally was passionate about.
But very much at the time, I felt very young and very inexperienced, and I felt that my own life and the things I saw in the world were not going to be of interest to people. But they felt interesting to me, and so I was looking for a language, I was looking for a genre in which I could take things that I was interested in and make them accessible, make them interesting to other people. And I think that the crime genre, the film noir genre, I think that's the way it works. It's characters are defined through action, double-cross, things they're doing to each other, your particular fears about whatever it is, your life, your relationships, whatever those things are. The best film noir has always been very firmly founded on those relatable fears?
No, I love working with family and friends and people you work with a long time. I mean, Emma is my longest and closest collaborator, and she's produced in various forms all of the films I've done. It's great to be able to work with people who don't have any agenda other than helping you make the best film that you can. And it's surprising how difficult it is to forge those relationships in a business context. And so where you've had the pleasure of working with people where money and business and everything wasn't even a part of what you were doing, it's wonderful if you're able to hang on to those relationships. And so there are a lot of people like the composer David Julian, who I worked with for years, who's a friend from college, you know, the various people like that who I work with. I worked with the director of photography, Wally Pfister, for many years, and Memento was the first film we did together, which was a very small film. There's an ease of communication that develops, and there's a trust. And, you know, when people are around you who only really want the best for the film, and you know that, when they tell you you're wrong or you're doing something stupid, or, you know, you should lower the tone of your voice or whatever they happen to be telling you, you tend to pay attention. I think working in films today, it's an era where people tend to watch films more than once, even if they don't like them. You know, you'll see it in the cinema on its first release, perhaps, and then you'll see it on, you know, cable television, or television you'll watch it on an airplane or in a hotel room or something, or it winds up eventually on regular TV. And so I think my generation of filmmakers understood really there's a responsibility to try and make something that has layers, something that has more to it the second time you see it, or some different aspect to it. And I chose to take the path of incorporating that desire for a layered approach into the narrative itself, into the story, if you like. And so I've made films that have some ambiguity to them, or some layering to them narratively, so that if you see them a second time, you're going to watch them in a slightly different way. That was my approach. There are other filmmakers who approach it from a purely visual point of view, where they would just create very dense visuals that would sustain multiple viewings because you'd sort of see more in the frame.
I mean, for me, the only sincerity in filmmaking is to make a film that you would want to go see yourself, and not treat the audience as anything separate from you. Our expectations when we go to see a film are different in different genres and at different budget levels, and that doesn't mean we're dumber when we go see a bigger film, or, you know, but we do have different expectations. It's a different register of language, in a sense.
I've always found dreams to be a very inspiring part of my life. I think the idea that has always fascinated me about dreams is the realization that everything within that dream is created by your own mind as you experience it. And it's that peculiar relationship between the creative part of imagining a world, imagining someone talking to you, and then the realization that as you absorb that world, you're not aware of the fact that you've actually created it. So if you're talking to somebody in a dream, you're supplying both halves of that conversation, but you seem to be experiencing just from one half. And I think that what that says about the potential of the human mind is quite extraordinary. And Inception is intended to be a film that tries to explore the exciting possibilities of what that says about the human mind and the infinite potential of the human mind.
And so the structure I settled on is one that it's based on a musical structure called the shepherd tone, which is a musical illusion whereby you can keep climbing up the scale. It's something I'd used in my scores, like the David Julian score for The Prestige was the first time we experimented with it. So you're continually going up the scale, but you never seem to go out of reach, if you like. And I wanted to try and apply that to screenwriting, to a narrative, and say, okay, with this story, can you braid together the three storylines in such a way that you create the idea of a continuing rise in intensity narratively? And sustaining that is the challenge of the structure and the way in which I approach different or complex structures, as I have in the past, and I do with this film, is you diagram it, you get a hold of it mathematically, so you know exactly what it's meant to be doing. But then you sit down and you write the script from page one right through to the end of the film, the way the audience is going to be receiving that information. The hope is that in that way, you're actually creating a cohesive and an organic rhythm and story movement built on a very constructed set of parameters, but not through cutting and pasting, not creating a fractured narrative so much as disparate story threads that braid together to make one coherent story. I've always loved the spy genre. I grew up watching the James Bond films and later on the Bourne films and the Jean le Carré and all of these great representations of espionage in fiction, and the escapist component to that, I think, is a big part of that. For me, cinematically, what the spy film always allowed was the idea of international travel, the idea of the glamour, being able to go places in the cinema that you'd never be able to go in real life, and have access to all kinds of extraordinary situations that you get to enjoy by proxy. And that's very much what we tried to bring to Tenet, but we tried to do it with an added science fiction component. We tried to do it with a concept that would allow audiences to approach this in a fresh way. For me, Tenet really is about taking the elements of spy fiction and particularly cinematic, spy fiction, and having new reason to look at them in a different way, taking them and turning them on their heads, really. It wasn't conscious on my part to have another script sort of ready to go by the time we went to film festivals with Following. While we were finishing up the cut on it and doing very long, slow technical finishing, which when you have no money takes forever because you're sort of waiting for the lab to have run the 16mm bath, whatever it is. In that time, I was putting together the script for Memento, and so also in the time it took to get Following noticed on the festival circuit and sort of get out there, I had actually finished the script. And in retrospect, it was a massive advantage because I was able to say, okay, you like that film, this is what I want to do next. Because in your best case scenario of what can happen to you with putting a film out there and getting distribution, for example, you'll then ask the question, okay, well, what do you want to do next? And if you have an answer, you can use that very short window of interest that you get from people in what you've done